Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh said today that while the terror group is showing some flexibility in talks for a potential deal that would include releasing some hostages held in Gaza and a temporary ceasefire, it is prepared to continue fighting. This as negotiators in Qatar continue to push hard for a deal by the start of Ramadan, which begins March 10th. Today, families of those held by Hamas began a 4-day march from the Gaza border to Jerusalem, calling for all of the hostages to be freed. Joining us now, NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez, who is in Tel Aviv, and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Admiral James Stavridis. Welcome both. So, Raf, neither Hamas nor Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu appear to be on board with President Biden's hope that there's a ceasefire by next Monday. Not sharing that optimism. But the talks are underway, and Qatar, the leaders there are putting out the word that they're working very hard on it. What is the latest?
Well, Andrea, I spoke to an Israeli official earlier today, and they said at this point the talks are basically at a standstill. You'll remember last weekend, CIA Director Bill Burns, other U.S. officials met in Paris with counterparts from Israel, Qatar, and Egypt. They hammered out this broad framework for a temporary ceasefire, and this Israeli official tells me they are still waiting for Hamas's formal response to that. Now, we went and we asked Hamas about that, and one of their senior political officials, Bassem Naim, confirms they are studying this proposal. They have yet to give a formal response to it, but he says there are major gaps still between the two sides, and he cites 3 specific areas, and they will be familiar to our viewers because they have been the issues that have dogged these talks all the way through. The question of whether this ceasefire would be temporary, which is what Israel says must happen, or permanent, which is what Hamas says it wants. It says it wants this ceasefire to lead to a complete end of the war. The question of whether Israeli forces would withdraw from the cities inside the Gaza Strip during a temporary ceasefire, or whether they would leave the Gaza Strip altogether. And finally, this question of allowing Palestinian civilians to return to Gaza City and the rest of the north of the Strip. Now, the situation in Gaza City right now, in the northern half of Gaza, is absolutely dire. The UN is saying it is unable to make food deliveries to the northern half of the Strip right now, partly because of Israeli military restrictions and partly because there is just a complete collapse of law and order right now in the north of the Strip. And so you have crowds of desperate people basically looting trucks the second they come in. Our crews in Gaza have seen families that are cooking literally flakes of barley that are intended for donkeys, and they are cooking them into kind of what look like pancakes, latkes, and trying to feed their children with them. We are hearing from one of the functioning hospitals in northern Gaza. They say at least 4 children have died from combinations of dehydration, malnourishment in the last couple of days, and the UN is warning that there is a real risk of famine in northern Gaza if there isn't a ceasefire and if there isn't an opportunity to get this aid distribution onto a much steadier footing. Andrea.
And Admiral, the situation on the ground is so fraught. We're hearing from Israeli generals disagreements, profound disagreements with the Prime Minister, but he is insisting that they're going to go ahead and invade Rafah without giving the U.S. its demanded plan for what he would do with the 1 million people plus who were there. You know, people who've been relocated, who are living in the worst conditions, in tents, no food, no water, no fuel.
Yeah, the Israelis, from a military perspective, have essentially an impossible task. They've got 4 things they're trying to do, which in many ways are contradictory. Number one, they want to destroy Hamas or render it completely incapable of military response. They're perhaps 2/3 of the way toward doing that. That's a lot of progress, but it's come at a huge cost, which is the second problem to which you and Raf just alluded, which is this terrible humanitarian crisis right in front of all of us. And then the other side of this is the need for the Israelis to get their hostages and all the while defend to the north against Hezbollah. Very difficult package. I think they'll end up going into Rafah, but not for some time to come.